I'd like to introduce our two speakers today. We have Frank Dama and Frank Alarcon. Frank Dama is the Director of the State and Local Policy Program at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He manages research projects related to transportation policy, including impacts of development in information and communications technologies and urban corridor development. He was named the second director of the State and Local Policy Program in October 2015, and his current projects include examining the interrelationship between traffic laws, speeding, and safety, as well as other policy issues, including working on policies related to automated vehicles that may or may not obey the speed laws. In addition to working at the Humphrey School, he's worked for the Canadian Pacific Railroads, the Metropolitan Airport Commission, and the Minnesota Department of Transportation. He has a master's in public affairs and a law degree. Frank Alarcon is a research assistant in the State and Local Policy Program and a master's of urban and regional planning candidate. Outside the university, Frank Alarcon works in transit planning for Ramsey County and serves as president of the Lyndale Neighborhood Association in South Minneapolis. Before joining the Humphrey School, Frank served as a Peace Corps volunteer in rural El Salvador. Anyway, without further ado, Frank Dama will start. Then we're going to pass the baton to Frank Alarcon and then back to Frank Dama. Frank?
Thank you, Max. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to present this work. As Chelsea mentioned, we'll take questions at the end. The advantage of the two of us today is that when you do have a question, just say, "Hey, Frank," and one of us will answer. The research that we present today is going to build upon work that I have done over the last several years looking at the relationship between speed, safety, and specifically speed enforcement. Actually, I believe some of the presentations of that previous work are on the Roadway Safety Institute website. So I am going to briefly, as way of introduction, go over some of the key findings from these a couple of previous studies. If you'd like to know more, I do invite you to go to the websites and get a chance to hear me talk even longer. The first research that I wanted to point out is what we call impact of exempting low-level speed violations. This was work that we specifically were looking at what's known as the Dimmler Law in Minnesota. You may or may not know, but in Minnesota, if you are pulled over for going up to 65 miles an hour in a posted speed limit zone of 55 or 60, you still have to pay the ticket, but that ticket does not go on to your state driving record. And we had the opportunity to look at what implications that may have had on people's driving behavior and perceptions of speed. Then the research immediately preceding the project we'll talk about today, we were looking more specifically at automated speed enforcement, the idea that you could be caught exceeding the posted speed limit by a camera, a radar-activated camera, and the ticket would be issued to you. And this is done in a number of different states by a number of different methods. But basically, you would not need to be pulled over in person. This is a very controversial policy. It is not currently done in Minnesota, and we were looking at what are some of the reasons for that. What we found from these two studies in particular is, first of all, there is a disconnect between the recognition of speed and safety on the road. Stakeholders, those who are involved in setting and enforcing policy related to speed and speed enforcement, are not aware, or at least their actions do not show an awareness that some of the public really don't believe that anything printed in black and white on a sign really means what it says in black and white on a sign. And essentially this is fueling a perception that enforcement of speeding should be a low priority. More specifically, what we found in this research previously is that there are a number of people in the public at large in Minnesota who actually see speed as a good thing. And the faster they feel they can go in their perception of safety, the better, regardless of exactly what that posted speed limit is. And as I mentioned, this is not seen as an excessive problem by those who are involved in enforcement and setting those speed limits. In particular, we find it's younger drivers, particularly younger male drivers, that tend to be involved in exceeding the speed limit, in being involved in speed-related crashes, and logically are most opposed to automated speed enforcement because they believe they know better than those who set the speed limit. Now let's get into some specific pieces here. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Getting into some numbers though, we find that given the data that's available, that perception is not necessarily reality. In 2014, speed was a factor in fatal crashes more often than those involving alcohol, drugs, other medication, and more than those that involve distracted driving. While at the same time, the population continues to believe that speed is a good thing. 1 out of 3 respondents to this particular survey said, I enjoy the feeling of speed. And more than half get impatient with slow drivers. Exceeding the posted speed limit is common practice. I may try and trip you up in the room once or twice asking you if you've ever done it. I'm not going to do it this time, but you know who you are if you're in this room and you have ever gone past one of those speed limit signs and it starts to flash at you because you are going too fast. It's probably happened to just about all of us, whether we actually get ticketed or not. What we conclude from this previous work is that this is, while not necessarily what you would expect from a safety perspective, it is one that fits the current environment of speed regulation. And we see that we need to work toward an environment where speeders are actually seen as endangering others rather than promoting some sort of greater good, and that when anybody speeds, they can be certain that they will have negative ramifications for doing that, rather than being rewarded by, at the very least, getting to where they want to go faster. Specifically then for this research, we've discovered that the number of speed-related fatalities increased from 2014 to 2015, up to approximately 9,500 in 2015, showing that, again, even though the culture says speeding is good, the numbers show that it is probably not. It does contribute to the frequency and severity of all crashes, and we were not the only ones to show that if speed enforcement is to be effective, we need to increase the certainty and the severity of speed enforcement. Despite that, we see laws going in the other direction. Now, it has been a personally surprising finding that the typical college undergraduate now, between the ages of 18 and 22, does not remember when we had a national speed limit because they weren't born. As of 1995, we ended having a national speed limit of 55 miles an hour. Now, it was enforced and brought about through some very interesting legal mechanisms that I won't go into here, but that nonetheless was repealed in 1995. And since then, all 50 states have increased their speed limit. This was an action taken by 50 different state legislatures. As I mentioned, Minnesota has a law that even says we have speed limits that are 55 or 60, but we really don't mean it like it's really 55 or 60. That is the Dimmler law. And other states, such as Michigan, have recently increased their maximum speed limit just within the last year from 70 miles an hour to 75. So I'm trying to frame this as being not necessarily rational, and that's probably an overstatement. What we do see is that there is a public choice issue going on here, and it's an issue that laws are reflecting public ambivalence toward enforcement of speed limits and the safety benefits of enforcing those speed limits. In 2011, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration conducted a survey that on the one hand showed we as a people, 79% at least, do agree that speeding at or near the speed limit does reduce my chances of a crash. That's good from a safety perspective. But only half of us believe that speed limits should be enforced all the time, which is kind of contradictory. And also, only half believe that it's important that something be done to reduce speeding. So even though we believe that there is a safety benefit to having us all drive the same speed, more than half of us don't want to see it enforced to make that happen. So this led to the question of, well, how are we going to move from that reality to a situation that we all understand and want to abide by the speed limit so that we can get a safety benefit? And I will turn it over to Frank A. to talk specifically then about the findings from this work.
Good afternoon. I'll be talking about the analysis we performed as part of this research project and our findings. So our work began with a literature review, and we found a good amount of interesting stuff, mostly from outside the United States, that largely confirms kind of the dynamic that Frank Dauma just illustrated. So for instance, a 2006 study by Fleeter and Watson out of Australia that was based on surveys found that while most motorists acknowledge that speed is a problem in some way or another, most, regardless of that, prefer to exceed the speed limit. And they describe this as a mismatch between beliefs and behaviors. A report out of Sweden, I believe, found that it looked at both voting data and survey data of drivers and had a very interesting methodology. And what it found is that people who report to prefer higher speeds often do so thinking that they hold that policy preference out of kind of communal interest rather than self-interest. But what they really find is that people who prefer to speed tend to be the speeders, or the people who think that they're great drivers who should be driving faster than everyone else. But they kind of confuse that policy preference with something that's in all of society's interest. A recent report, also out of Sweden, was more of a qualitative analysis of the process for setting speed limits in one county in Sweden. And through interviews with different actors like engineers, policymakers, public administrators, it identified two conflicting perspectives that were held among those different actors. One was the mobility perspective, and that was the perspective that favored higher speeds in service of more regional economic development in that county. And the second perspective was labeled the safety perspective, and this is the perspective that favors lower speeds, lower speed limits, and greater safety. And interestingly, what this paper basically found was that practically the only people who held the safety perspective were the folks whose job it was specifically to promote safety. So maybe the safety engineer held the safety perspective, but most of the other actors preferred the mobility perspective. So higher speeds, more economic development. And very importantly, the elected officials were found to subscribe to the mobility perspective, even though elected officials have a dual mandate in this situation. Elected officials are responsible both for promoting economic development and for protecting the public safety. But in this study, the elected officials were found to kind of lean toward that mobility perspective. Our literature review also led us to the issue of lobbying. Lobbying for higher speeds might come from a number of different perspectives. One might be a civil liberties perspective. Regulating speed infringes upon the freedom of drivers to drive as they wish. And also there are commercial interests that might push for higher speeds and wider roads and infrastructure that encourages speeding. And one study out of Norway found that public officials face much more lobbying in favor of mobility and higher speeds than for safety. And I'd be really interested to see similar research in the United States. So, bringing our analysis down to Region 5, which was the geographic scope for our research, what we wanted to do was compare 3 bodies of data to see if there was a relationship. So those 3 bodies of data were the speed laws in the Region 5 states, the speed-related crash and fatality data out of those 6 states, and survey data of public perceptions and attitudes around speed and speed laws. And our working hypothesis was that the states with the greatest clarity and certainty of speed enforcement should have better outcomes on the road, so lower crash and fatality rates. And so our first body of data was speed laws, and we initially set out to kind of create a typology of different laws, hoping that we could create kind of a straightforward ranking and say, this state has good speed laws, this state has mediocre speed laws, this state has poor speed laws. Unfortunately, we discovered that there were so many points of differentiation in the speed regimes of different states that creating kind of a straightforward typology like that was really difficult. So a few of the major points of differentiation was the type of speed law. So some states have what's called a prima facie speed limit. This means that exceeding the speed limit is not actually the infraction. The infraction is driving at a speed that's unsafe for conditions. And exceeding the speed limit is evidence of that infraction, but it is not the infraction in and of itself. And then on the other hand, you have states with an absolute speed law. And what that means is that exceeding the speed limit is a crime. And then even to complicate things more, you have some states which have a mixed speed law. So on certain roadways, there's an absolute speed limit. And on other roadways, there's a prima facie speed limit. And somehow the motorist just has to know which type of roadway they're on. Other points of differentiation, as shown by this map, differences in the maximum speed limit. There are some states go up to as high as 85, some as low as, I believe, 65 or 60. The severity of punishments is quite varied across states. The same unsafe driving behavior in one state might be a minor misdemeanor, and it might be a significantly more severe crime in another state. And unless you've kind of studied the legal code of whatever state you're driving in, you're just not likely to know that. Also, some states have kind of added penalties for reckless driving. So they'll legislate that if you're exceeding the speed limit by 25 miles an hour or 30 miles an hour, it tacks on additional severity to the infraction. Other states don't have any such law. And then some states allow automated speed enforcement, which Frank Dauma has done quite a bit of research on. Other states do not. And so automated speed enforcement, which uses radars or cameras to catch people speeding, increase the certainty of punishment for a speed infraction. And some states use it, some states don't. So here's a table just to show some points of differentiation of speed regimes throughout Region 5. So you'll see half have an absolute speed limit, half have a mixed speed limit. Some specify a particular speed that's considered reckless driving, or a particular speed above the posted speed limit that's reckless driving. Other states don't. 2 of them use automated speed enforcement, and 4 of them do not. And then an additional twist that we came across was that the relationship across states between the posted speed limit, the design speed of the roadway, and the operating speed of the roadway, it differs across states. There's kind of competing guidance. Many states use the 85th percentile rule, which is kind of the standard way to set speed limits, but increasingly there's been different organizations questioning that methodology and encouraging, setting a target speed that's either at or below the posted speed limit. And so that's kind of an additional wrinkle that makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to kind of evaluate different states' speed laws and regimes side by side. And so we concluded overall that the differences in speed laws between the 6 states that we were looking at are so vast that we weren't able to develop that typology that we had initially hoped we could. But nonetheless, we looked at our other 2 bodies of data to see what we could find. And so the next body of data was speed-related crash and fatality data. And probably the most comprehensive database on that issue is FARS, which is the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, which is maintained by NHTSA. And so NHTSA collects data around every roadway fatality in the country and compiles that data by state. And so, and it does have a field for whether the fatality was related to speed. And so we dug into this data, and right away we noticed a very high level of differentiation. So on the slide, I point out the most extreme case, which was that, and this table is from a NHTSA report from 2014, I believe. According to this data, 10% of the roadway fatalities in 2014 in Florida were related to speed. And then on the other hand, that same year in Pennsylvania, 43% of roadway deaths, speed was implicated. And so this kind of gave us some pause. How can there be quite that much variation between 2 states? And so we looked into the literature to see if there was any guidance, and sure enough, there's a small but growing body of literature about problems with the reporting of speed-related crashes and fatalities across the United States. So just last year, NTSB concluded that the law enforcement reporting of speed-related crashes is inconsistent. Another 2017 report found that sometimes when an officer reports a crash, in their narrative description of the crash, they might mention excessive speed, but they don't necessarily check the box or the driver contributing code, DCC, for speed. And so when that crash is entered into different databases, it doesn't register as speed related, even though the officer reported it as speed related in the narrative area of that report. And then a very interesting article out of the South Dakota, the Rapid City Journal in 2015 found that in the case of that state, just raising the speed limit can affect the proportion of crashes that are considered speed related, because all of a sudden, if your speed limit's higher, and fewer crashes are going to happen above that speed limit, and suddenly your data is different. So again, with this body of data, we didn't find a high enough level of consistency across states to be able to kind of make any confident rankings within Region 5. We weren't able to say that the crashes in Michigan are more likely to be related to speed than in Ohio. But moving on to our third and last body of data that we looked at, public perceptions of speed. So these are these surveys that are finding some really interesting things about what people think about speed. And so Frank Dauma earlier mentioned this 2011 NHTSA survey, National Survey of Speeding Attitudes and Behaviors. It's a very interesting read, and it provides a great national snapshot. but it's not stratified by state with a sufficient sample in each state to allow us to compare the attitudes of drivers in Wisconsin's to Minnesota's. So it's kind of good at that high level, but didn't enable the kind of comparisons that we wanted to make. And so we decided to look for state-level survey data of driver attitudes about speed. And we found some for 3 of our states, and for the other 3 we weren't able to find anything. So we found some surveys for Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin from the last 10 or 12 years or so. And in these surveys largely found consistently with kind of what the literature says and what we've previously commented about driver attitudes about speed. So Michigan, for example, that survey found that 87% of Michigan drivers believe that speed limits in their community are just about right. And remember, Michigan is the state that just raised speed limits for, I believe, over about 600 miles of state highways. Furthermore, 62% of respondents to that survey found that, believe that they personally are less likely to be involved in a crash than the average driver. And 78.7% believe themselves to be a better driver than the average driver. Minnesota, pretty similar picture, 73% of survey respondents believe that the level of enforcement in their communities is just about right. So again, you're not going to see a big groundswell of support for more enforcement if 73% of your population is content with the existing level of enforcement. 70% believe that they are less likely to be involved in a crash than the average driver. Again, very confident drivers. Interestingly, this figure was lower, 55%, for people who admitted that they speed. So what that suggests is that people who are speeders and are willing to admit to that are aware that their speeding makes them less likely to get into a crash, and yet they still do it. And in Minnesota, we had 63% of respondents to the survey consider themselves to be above average drivers. So again, pretty confident drivers in Minnesota. Wisconsin, pretty similar picture. This was a slightly older survey, 2003, I believe. That kind of the narrative of following the survey found that when it comes to the issue of speeding, Wisconsin drivers perceive this as a moderate problem for the state, and there is little groundswell for treating speeding more seriously. And in Wisconsin, 50% of respondents consider themselves to be better than most drivers, and so a little less confidence in Wisconsin. So I'll hand it back to Frank Dalma to talk about our conclusions and recommendations.
So despite what you may think, one of our conclusions is not that they just teach statistics better in Wisconsin, and that's the only state that understands 50% can be average or better. What we did come around to conclude is that general crash data, literature, survey data, and laws reflect an ambivalence to the need to enforce or regulate speed for the purpose of enhancing safety. Despite data that indicates we have a fairly high crash rate, injury rate, and fatality rate due to speed, we don't see a groundswell of political push to regulate speed, and the laws themselves are moving in the opposite direction, allowing faster travel rather than safer travel. This led us to look exactly as to where the causal chain is going, and what we perceived on a qualitative level is that essentially this is a topic for which it's quite easy to pass the buck. Politicians can say we are not passing laws that lead to greater enforcement of speed limits because there is no political groundswell to do so. In fact, we're getting pressure to go the other direction. And law enforcement says we are not enforcing the law, or we may be enforcing the law, but we don't put a lot of emphasis on trying to make people stay within the speed limit because the laws are ambiguous. We know that people will not be held to account once they get to court, so on and so forth. The engineers and others that are involved in designing and building the roads say that they are building the roads as safe as possible, but it's the job of elected officials and so forth to actually create the laws that will dictate how fast people go. So we go back to the elected officials and say we don't hear it, and so we can then turn the eye back to ourselves, asking the question, well, are we actually the ones who are telling our elected officials that we need to have better speed enforcement, or are we pointing the other direction? Essentially, the way we can think about this is I could ask folks in the room here, or as we've seen on surveys, is it important to obey the speed limit? Most people would say yes. Is there a safety benefit to following the speed limit? Most people would say yes. And then I would say, and have you recently exceeded the speed limit yourself? Most people would say yes. We have this real nice ability to keep saying that somebody else needs to take that step. So who would do it? What would it take to get to that level? And this is where we get to the discussion that Frank A. just went through about the data. We don't have the data available consistently across jurisdictions from crashes, fatalities, etc., that allow us to make the definitive conclusions that if we have roads that are designed for a lower speed and we put a posted speed limit for a lower speed and we enforce that speed limit for a lower speed, we will see a safety benefit as a result in the statistics. We just don't have that data at this point, at least as we looked at it in Region 5. If we were to expand to 50 states, we would probably still find that problem because data collection is dictated more or less by the states or the local government, so we don't have this uniform database that can give us that information. How can we break this cycle? Well, National Transportation Safety Board did issue a report in 2017 that started to show there's an interest in moving forward. First of all, when it comes to the operating speed or the design speed, which is this idea of the 85th percentile, that you understand what the average generally operating speed is on a roadway. If you get to rebuild it, you will then design to have it be safe to that 85th percentile of that operating speed. And then you build the road, and what we have seen, at least anecdotally, is that the operating speed then increases because you have now made the road safer to drive even faster. The NHTSA report suggests maybe we think about designing toward a lower speed. It's actually probably going to cause people to behave more safely, even though the design appears to be less safe. It calls for implementation of automated speed enforcement simply for the idea that it increases the certainty of punishment. If you are going through a zone with a camera that doesn't sleep and is always on, and everyone who goes over the posted speed limit gets a ticket, most of them are going to learn they don't have the bank account to be able to continue that behavior, and they will change that behavior. And then finally, working to develop more consistent reporting of speed-related crashes so that we can compare state to state to state that certain behaviors related to speed are indeed leading to more severe crashes, more fatalities, and other undesirable outcomes. The key thing that we need to also point out is the one that Frank A. mentioned from South Dakota, which is that states should not be able to just improve their speed safety data by increasing their speed limit. As to our own final recommendations, we need to see better agreement, as we mentioned, to what speed-related means, whether it's exceeding the speed limit or driving at a certain level leads to worse outcomes. We would love to see more national-level surveys with sufficient samples in each state to enable cross-state comparisons. Basically, we thought that the 2011 NHTSA survey provided a lot of good information pointing out this dichotomy, if you will, of people who think that speed enforcement is good, but just not for them and just not all the time. If we could get that kind of data in sufficient numbers for each state, we could maybe start to understand why 3 out of 4 people in Michigan believe that they are better than average drivers, but only half of them drivers in Wisconsin are, and what's behind those beliefs, and so on and so forth. That could help us better deliver education about the dangers of driving too fast. And then get around to speed laws and enforcement of those laws that provides for greater transparency and certainty. Automated speed enforcement is a very certain enforcement. Having a Dimmler law where some speed violations don't have the same ramifications as other speed violations is the opposite of transparency. And we need to make it clear and understandable that 55 means 55, really. It does. I remember billboards that used to say that, but that was when we had a national speed limit. I don't recall seeing that more recently. And possibly because it doesn't, and we would like to see moving in that direction. And create a standard measurement for certainty of punishment in each state without necessarily saying that every state has to have an exact same speed law. Have some level of understanding that I can go 70 in Minnesota on the interstate, and I should only go 70. When I cross the state line to South Dakota and it says 80, I can go 80. But in either state, if I go 81 or 71, opposite respectively, it's going to result in some kind of citation. So we have finished our full report and gone through various reviews and so forth, and I believe it is on its way to being published on the Road Safety Institute website. And we also have a shorter version that was just accepted to be published in the spring 2018 edition of the Journal of Transportation Law, Logistics, and Policy. And with that, I will refer you to a number of the works that got us to this point, and we'd be happy to open for questions.
David Sullivan Nightingale from Como Park Engineering Associates would like to know, have you had an opportunity to compare residential street perception of speed with main artery perception of speed?
In looking, we did not get down to that level of that. That in some cases is the relationship of operating speed, design speed, and so forth. But what we were looking at was how people reacted overall to their surroundings as well as to the posted speed limit sign.
Where do you think the majority of the opposition to automated speed enforcement is coming from? From like police unions or politicians? Who's putting so much blowback if there's so much evidence that it's could be useful?
So the question is, what's controversial and what's the opposition to automated speed enforcement? This is what we looked at in the previous study, and there's a number of different pieces behind that. Everything from belief that it's an invasion of privacy to belief that that government just doesn't have the right to be able to keep track of what you're doing on the roadway, to the belief that you have the right to do kind of what you want to on the roadway. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning, mostly found in tending to be younger populations, more male populations that you have that kind of opposition. It does break down. You can try to break it down in terms of different stakeholders, but really this is what led to our research here. Comes down to more this idea that there's just this general sort of public choice that's being made in favor of faster is better. And until we get over that perception that faster is better, there is going to be somebody, and a number of somebodies, who are going to resist the idea that we all have to travel at the same speed. Did that make sense?
What is the assessment of the fatality rate with the devil's triangle of speed, alcohol, and lack of seatbelt use as a percentage, where you have all three together as a percentage of the total fatalities in a given year? And has that trend improved over the last 20 years or not?
We did not look at that very specific statistical question. There have been studies that show there is a definite relationship that if you are more inclined to speed, you are less inclined to use your seatbelt and more inclined to drive under the influence. So that there is a relationship in those. And actually, again, you also tend to be a younger male in believing that you're going to do that. Like I said, I don't have the data whether that has changed significantly over time in terms of percentage of the population or percentage of crashes where 1, 2, or all three of those are present. But it does. You do see a correlation in terms of how that works. We see seatbelt use is going up quite a bit in Minnesota. It's measured at over 95%, and obviously breaking the speed limit is a much lower percentage. But when it comes to how exactly that's breaking out in those combinations on actual fatalities, I just don't have that number in front of me.
I would comment that I've done a lot of driving in Montana since they raised the speed limit to 80 on the freeway. And the incidence of people going faster than 80, which I tend to do for a variety of reasons, is greatly reduced from what it was. In other words, there seems to be a tacit enforcement policy on the part of the highway patrol that 80 is 80. And it seems to be real.
Right. That is something that does seem to come into it, and as we recommended, that if you come up with an enforcement regime that says this is where it's going to be, then people will start to respond. It's when you get resistance to that. I can't point to a specific study, but I believe I've seen some in my head that similar situations after the national speed limit was repealed, states said, okay, we'll go to 65 because that's what the electorate wants, but the electorate wants, but we will enforce 65. And that worked fine until some state went to 70. And the drivers started to push up towards 70. And maybe resources got moved within the state patrol or something like that, and suddenly the de facto speed became 70, and so the legislature responds and says, okay, you want to go 70, but we really mean it this time, it's going to be 70. And that works maybe for a while. Now, when I was in South Dakota, my car really didn't like to go 80, so I wasn't going to be one that was going to eventually over time get comfortable going faster than that. But if I lived in South Dakota, I might buy a car that does. And so then you become comfortable going 80 and you start to maybe push it up a little bit further again.
A question from someone at NC Vision Zero asking if you have any advice on how to get support from local law enforcement in enforcing more speeding violations. They say this has been a challenge in their state for law enforcement agencies that are already understaffed.
Right, and that's kind of some of the things that we find is, it's the local law enforcement that are right there on the front lines, and they're the ones that see the resistance when they try to enforce the law, and they discover they've pulled over their neighbor who says, come on, I know you drove to work going 2 over as well. That becomes the cultural issue of we need to start understanding this. We need to build this perception, understanding, recognition that just because somebody goes a little over, it's no harm. And it's the same sort of issue that we overcame with smoking, that if I go over a little bit, who's going to hurt? When in reality, that if we all believe that, it's going to hurt quite a few of us. And so we need to begin that discussion. Frank, I don't know if you've got any further thoughts on that one.
I'm wondering how much resistance you might expect that we'll encounter in reframing this conversation regarding engineering, planning, and design folks in trying to get that design speed down more towards the speeds that we're actually trying to enforce, because my understanding of this is that that gap is what leads people to not really assign much risk to edging up and further into that gap there between the enforcement speed and the road design speed.
Well, that was was really a significant finding for us to discover. The NTSB issued the study saying, let's turn the idea of designing our roads on its head, and instead of trying to design for people to go faster, that we actually design for them to go slower. And people feel more comfortable at a lower speed and less comfortable at a higher speed. Again, using my own self as an example, in South Dakota, I felt okay going 80 once I finally got the car up to it, because I felt I could see anything coming at me from a long way away. There was no trees along the side of the road. There were no buildings or anything that was going to hide something jumping out at me. Whereas if you're driving on your neighborhood road, you would never feel comfortable going that fast, because the situation can change that quickly. And so it's that kind of thinking that is, I think, informing the idea of moving in the other direction. And to your question of, how much resistance do I see? Well, if we have the federal organizations starting to initiate that discussion, I think that can go a long way to helping people understand that it may there could be a movement toward that kind of a change in the way roads are designed. And the real benefit here is that to you and me, we just drive at what we're really comfortable at. We don't know that somebody is trying to engineer the speed we're driving at. So if the roads are changed so that we're driving at a safer speed, we will subconsciously start to move in that direction. Along with enforcement and just cultural change. Was there a question over here?
Yeah. Is there a difference in states that have multiple speed limits for interstates? So like some states have, one speed limit for automobiles and then one speed limit for combination vehicles. Does that affect like the public perception at all of either what a safe speed is or how annoying it is to kind of fight with the trucks about that, or
right?
Not really?
So the question is, if there's 2 speed limits, one for personal autos, one for commercial vehicles, or something like that, does that have create perception issues in terms of? We didn't specifically look at that question, but we never found any sort of situation that caused people to behave differently. That is still a fairly transparent situation. You know whether you're driving a commercial vehicle or a passenger vehicle. There is evidence that the traffic operating at different speeds is less safe than everybody operating at the same speed. So from that perspective, that may not be as safe. It's not a perception issue. It's an operational safety issue. To answer the question you didn't ask, which is, what about different enforcement regimes? As Frank Alarcon mentioned, we've got prima facie, we've got absolute, we've got combinations and so forth. We've got states with Dimmler laws, and we've got other sorts of, different gradations of how bad is bad. That is also, that's a perception issue that we did find, that people, it's not a transparent speed law anymore. And so folks begin to believe that they can push the law in certain directions, whether they can or not. And that leads, again, to that same situation of certain people feeling comfortable at certain speeds, driving on the same roadway, with others driving at different speeds. And that's not as safe as if we're all going at the same.
So we've obviously seen a cultural groundswell with the whole texting and driving, distracted driving. What do you think you can learn from kind of that essentially marketing campaign in applying it to speed?
Well, I guess I'm going to first ask, when you say groundswell, do you see that as been an effective campaign or as just one that's been visible?
I think visible. I guess I don't know the data on it has actually been effective or not, but I think it's something that people talk about and you see a lot, and you see it almost as I would call it like a cultural movement, in that it becomes part of our kind of lexicon, and the whole texting and driving as a phrase almost that people can recognize exactly what that means.
Right. Yeah, it has been a more visible campaign than trying, to keep people to drive the speed limit. There's two things to see here. One is that maybe there's something to see, because when you actually look at the numbers, speeding is much more responsible for fatalities and severe crashes than texting is. But at the same time, you need to merely look around as you're driving, and you see that we're still texting and having our phones out as we're driving. So I'm not sure that it's completely been effective in getting us to change our behavior to being as safe as possible. So that raises the question of, texting and driving, somehow we didn't quite get ahead of that. I still remember when that started to become an issue, that seemed like it was going to be nipped in the bud and everybody would figure it out. And instead, it just happened, and it was as if the initial efforts were never there. Instead, looking at what is it that caused us to start over 95% of us, 19 out of 20, putting on a seatbelt? Well, now you can get pulled over for not having a seatbelt on and for no other violation. You have clear evidence of when seatbelts are used and not used, and clear evidence of what is the difference in terms of your ability to survive a crash if you're using it or you're not using it. It's getting to that level of clarity, I think, that we need to look to rather than the texting and driving.
Another webinar question from David Sullivan Nightingale. Will we be getting criteria from the government to determine who will be responsible for failures or design features that result in an autonomous vehicle exceeding the speed limit?
Phrase that one more time. I want to make sure I understand it.
Will we be getting criteria from the government to determine who will be responsible for failures or design features that result in an autonomous vehicle exceeding the speed limit?
Will we be getting guidance from the government? Don't bet on it. Will we be getting some effort to try to make sure that autonomous vehicles are obeying the speed limit? Yes. This is becoming, I think, a key feature and driver of those who are developing the technologies, that if they are developing what we call the level 4, the level 5 vehicles, where the vehicle really does the driving and is responsible for taking care of any unsafe situations, those vehicles are going to be designed to understand the safe driving speed on the facility they're on, and they will operate at that speed. Until we get there, you can take your, what we call level 2 Tesla, and you can tell it to go as fast as you want it to go. And that is a fairly cut and dried situation of we can look at the data and discover that it wasn't the car that sped, it was the person telling the car to speed. Now, if you get to a car malfunctioning and it chooses to go faster because something didn't work right, even though it was designed and told to go the appropriate speed, what we are seeing is the companies that are developing these technologies, at least for now, are saying, we're cool with this, we want the liability for that. They are accepting the product's liability for that right now. They are showing that they're serious enough about it, and they believe the safety benefit is going to be so great that even in a situation where that does happen, the safety benefits have otherwise outweighed the cost of accepting that liability.
The one number that showed up in one of the previous presentations out of the Road Safety Institute, as well as yours, is the 8360 fatalities due to speed. The question I have is, what percentage of those were on interstates versus non? And if you know that?
I don't know that specifically. We do have the link on that one that you can go to the slides and be able to look up that report, but I don't know that off the top of my head. I would speculate that because we also know that greater percentage of the fatalities happen on rural roads, on 2-lane roads, and so forth, that more likely you'll see of that 8360 where speed is an issue that also is going to be proportionally higher on non-interstate type roads. And here comes the Master of Ceremonies.
Clearly a very interesting seminar and more questions than I've seen in any seminar until now. But anyway, why don't you join me in thanking the two Franks for their presentation. And let me also invite you to come back next week, same time, same place. We have a presentation by Rondell Berg from General Motors, who will be talking, always be sure to check your surroundings, driver performance research in the age of driverless cars. So again, we'll see you next week, same time, same place, and thank you all for coming. Have a good day.
I think everybody got that. Oh, great, thank you. Yeah, no problem. Frank, Alarcon. Yeah, I've had 10 different people tell me I need to connect with you. I'm a dual public health urban planning master's student, interested in business, scaling and transition. So, I'm in my card, but I'm sure I can find you on the global. That's just my personal email. Yeah, oh yeah, you've got a card. Yeah, great. I'd love to have coffee with you on your break. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can imagine one. Callie Turner, stressing down. She said really good things about you, and so I should connect with you. And so did Olivia, who's in your airport.
Also, last week I watched online, but I couldn't say I was watching the chat, because I was watching